Well, good evening. It must be Monday.
It must be Monday right around 9 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken.
It is indeed. So, how are you doing this evening, Ron?
I'm hanging in there, my friend. How are you?
Very well. Looks like we got a couple of folks popping in to say hello. But yeah, we got a very fun show tonight. So welcome anyone who's out there watching. Hopefully, some folks will pop in as we go through the evening. But yeah, this is going to be, I think, a really interesting topic and one that's a little bit off the cuff for us. A little different approach.
I think this is a good palate cleanser from last week.
Yes, yes, definitely a little more upbeat than last week. Although we've got some controversial stuff to go through even tonight, so I'm looking forward to discussing sort of the fairly wild ride that comic book heroes have had over the course of the last really close to a century now, which is remarkable.
Right. So, as a
So
kid, you said you were a DC guy. Is that right?
I've always been a little bit of a mix of both. I like DC,
Okay.
I like Marvel, but I really kind of cut my teeth on Batman and Superman, so they do have a good place in my heart.
Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah, I was always a Spider-Man guy, and then later on, whenever I was in high school, I got into the X-Men. But yeah, so you have to inform me a lot. I mean, I have a working knowledge of most of the DC characters, but really, my heart belongs over there with Stan Lee and his folks.
Well, we're going to talk about them as well tonight. So
Yeah.
yes, so for those of you folks, if you didn't see the pop up for the show, so we're going to be talking about the origin of sort of the superhero myth and how we called it 21st century gods, and how I think that the modern superhero myth has kind of risen up to take sort of the place of the old age of mythology. And so I am really looking forward to it as somebody who grew up on comic books.
And there is a fervent love for this as well, too, bordering pseudo-religious type of reverence, because people are really into this. And I will tell you, whenever I went to go see X-Men, I actually got to see it at drive-in, and there were people complaining because a lot of the stuff was not canon. And
Yeah.
whenever you start throwing the word canon around, it already has a religious mystique to it. So a lot of people look at this definitely as if it is a religious experience.
It's an interesting discussion too, and people have been talking, having this discussion now for as long as they've been adapting comic books into films or media. Is how often it is or isn't canon, and it's interesting. The way I look at it is that most of these comics have been being published for at least 50 years, some of them for 60, 70. Superman is more than 80 years old now, and that every generation or so, they have to reboot these characters anyway. They've got to either start from scratch or something like that, because you can't have all that jumble of storyline and all the different characters and not eventually just have it overcrowded. And so DC Comics, which created Superman, Batman, and these characters, actually created something back in the 1980s called the Crisis, which they used to actually in comic as a story reboot their entire universe, and a lot of other comic creators have followed on that. So I think, as I say, this is going to be interesting. I did, as I say, I'm going to throw up a quick slide here. I grew up on these comic books. We've got Avengers, Spider-Man, Superman, Justice League of America, Batman, so many amazing characters. But these were published starting the Marvel comics like Avengers and Spider-Man started in the 1960s. Superman and the Justice League and some of these actually started back in the 1930s. And now, 75, 80 years later, the truth is that they haven't changed that much. We still have the Avengers and Spider-Man, Superman, and the Justice League are all still out there, but now they are also a multi-billion-dollar industry. In fact, the superhero films of the last decade or so are now topping over $30 billion in ticket sales, which is, I think, interesting because so many people, I think, write these films off as as irrelevant, and it's hard, I think, to do that when they start to to be worth more than the economy of a small country. So, I mean,
Right.
I think it's a maybe a foolish thing to write them off too easily.
Right. I agree with you totally. And also, the way I look at it is the actors very rarely are doing this simply for a paycheck. Some of the finest acting that we have is coming from comic book movies right now. Starting back with Heath Ledger whenever he played the Joker, and then the reprise of the Joker with the yes, that guy. Joaquin Phoenix. Yeah,
Yeah.
so both Academy Award winners for their roles. And I think the reason why they're taking these roles so seriously is there is a deep vein to mine within these characters. They're very complex characters. They're not black and white just off of a page. These are characters that are motivated. These are not, like, as Auden would say, motiveless malignancies. These people are actually people just like you and I, who are dealing with the world around them the best way that they can. Some turn to evil and some turn to good, and that's, I think, the biggest difference. Even whenever I was a kid, reading comic books, the characters now, the superheroes now, have much more foibles and shortcomings than they did whenever I was a kid. They have a lot more fallibilities than they had before. They're much more human.
We're actually going to specifically address that a little bit later, in the program too, and how comic characters have evolved to that point. And actually, Sarah, a moment ago, had a great comment. She said that these characters are in some ways based on or inspired by sort of the great hero's journey, as often addressed in the books of Joseph Campbell. Now, I completely agree with that. And it's in a lot of ways the crux of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And so actually, I kind of wanted to, I'm going to throw up another slide here, and I already addressed this briefly, but it is an interesting question to ask how once what many people consider disposable genre of children's entertainment, comic books. I mean, look at the name comic books. It literally implies comedy, something that's frivolous, that's throwaway. And the earliest comic books were mostly just comic strips like Beetle Bailey and, things like that were just a few punchlines, a few jokes and a punchline. So how did these disposable magazines that many people never expected to last at all become a global multi-billion-dollar industry in the last decade? And I don't think that could happen if they were as irrelevant as some media figures, especially in the last few years, have suggested. Some very notable people, director Martin Scorsese referred to superheroes movies as being irrelevant and suggested that they're not even cinema. Francis Ford Coppola, when Scorsese got some blowback for that, went right in to defend him and actually said that he felt these movies were despicable and not worthy of a cinematic experience. Fairly recently, James Cameron, who is the creator of the Avatar films, Titanic, things like that, threw a lot of shade and basically said that these movies are, they're immature, they're like a bunch of kids in college. And all of this hatred being thrown at this, at not just the film industry, but at this now almost century-long heritage of these super characters. And why is it that people consider them so, I guess, irrelevant in the greater conversation?
I guess because it's, there's so much special effects involved. I think that's probably the biggest complaint. James Cameron is no. I mean, his movies are nothing without special effects.
Exactly.
His characters are very, very one-dimensional in the majority of his movies, and I think that there's a lot of jealousy out there because to do a comic book film well, you have to be very talented. Look at what Kenneth Branagh did with Thor, and I think that that's really one of the reasons why this business has taken off, is because you had somebody of his status take on a very difficult character and bring it to life. Although I don't believe that was the best Thor movie, the original Thor movie that was out, but you got to see Anthony Hopkins playing Odin. I mean, it was a great time to watch some serious actors doing their work.
And, it's interesting about the original Thor film, which came out now about close to 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
The original Thor film, I've always loved the character. We talked about Thor quite a bit, a couple of weeks ago in our Norse mythology episode. But I loved the character of Thor, discovered him through comic books, and from that was turned on to mythology. So again, it actually led me to become a more literate person. But when they started talking about making a Thor movie, I had huge doubts. I thought that, the previous superhero films have always kind of kept things grounded. They kind of kept things in a little bit of more of the mortal realm, because what you can show on a comic book page and what you can portray in film, often it's a leap from one to the other, and it doesn't work so well. So I thought that this magical character from this distant realm would be very hard to portray, and they've done a beautiful job with that. Marvel Studios, who created the comic characters of Thor and Spider-Man, the X-Men, etc., has done something that I don't think anyone ever truly believed, and they've actually brought the richness of comics into the screen, because for generations, when you and I grew up, when a comic character was portrayed on TV or in a movie, it was always in the most mundane of settings, because the technology simply didn't exist to really show comic books the way they are on the page. And now Marvel has brought this new universe, into existence in a way that is truly mythic.
Absolutely. Now, one of the other comic book that I really enjoyed as a kid was Conan the Barbarian, because there was a lot of violence. And your point is well taken, because look at Conan O'Brien, look
Yeah.
at Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Earl Jones whenever it first came out, and then imagine what they could do with it now. But they have tried a couple times, and it did not work out very well.
Well, you've got, in addition to special effects are never enough. You've also got to have a good script. You've got to, have a good writer. You have to have good actors, and you have to have somebody who has a vision for what the film can be. And unfortunately, with the best special effects in the world, that doesn't always work out.
Absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
so, how indeed did we get to a place where almost 100 years later, however, superheroes flourish so much? And I personally would say that superheroes, as we imply in the in the title of the episode, 21st century gods, is that they have taken over. An empty space in, I think, the human experience. Because if you wanted the clock back 1,000 years, 1,500 years, 2,000 years, and even farther than that, we lived in a very different world. And it's what I would often refer to as the age of mythology, an age when characters like Zeus and Odin and Poseidon and Hermes and Thor and all these characters were part of the belief systems and the storytelling of cultures all across the globe. And we incorporated not only the belief, the religious belief in these gods into our daily lives, but the storytelling aspect of it. So many of these ancient cultures thrived on storytelling, and they would tell these parables and these stories that often involved gods, demigods, mortals, getting sort of caught up in the affairs of gods. But that age ultimately died out in the, probably I would say the Middle Ages, when we were still overrun with religious sort of fervor, and most governments were religiously dominated. We began to, I think, burn out on the dominance of religious and mysticism, religious belief and mysticism in our daily lives, which led to what a lot of people call the Age of Reason, which is the late 1700s into the technically into the modern period, when we finally thought maybe science has something important to offer the world, and the domination of religion took a backseat to sort of a scientific worldview. But I think we lost something in there. I'm not saying that I want to go back to a theocracy by any means,
Right.
but the wonder and the magic of these great stories that drove us for so long really became secondary and a backseat. But I think we still needed an age of heroes, and I think that that's much what may have led to the creation of these characters.
Right. There's something magical about that one panel, whenever you first start and you read and find out what's going to happen next. Now, if I could argue a bit about this, I think whenever you look at the cave paintings of Lascaux, you're really seeing the formation of the idea that art can represent something and take on a life of its own. Then we interpret it the way that we want to. And, if you want to look at some of the greatest, panel pieces, if you look at the medieval cathedrals, and they have the life of Christ and the life of the saints in there, because so many people were illiterate that you had to teach them the gospel somehow. So you would put up these great works of art. And I would argue that we still have that to this day. We just have transferred them over to the comic book. And I think more and more people are getting into this through the graphic novels, which is kind of like a step up, if you will, from the comic book. But I think that we still have the idea of art representing something that we really need within our lives, and not only representing it in a way, but representing it so it's easily digestible as well. Whenever you pick up, you're not reading War and Peace. You know that you're going to get through this thing in about 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and you become part of it, right? You become part of it. And that's what I really, truly love about the comic book.
I fully agree with you. And in fact, what the medium of graphic novels, or graphic or sequential storytelling, is as popular refer to it right now, is again often frowned upon by people who consider themselves legitimate writers, or they don't consider it literature of any kind. But it's a short story form, and it requires writing, it requires plotting, but rather than using words to tell every aspect of the story, images are used to tell a lot of aspects of the story. And how is that any different than the paintings on cathedrals all throughout Europe that or something as you don't want to offend anybody here, but even the Stations of the Cross, which you see in Christian churches, which plays out the story of Christ's life and eventual death and sacrifice in sequential pictures. And
Right.
it's the idea, it's a way, you're right, to communicate to a broader audience, to make it more accessible to everyone. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But films, television, all of these different mediums are legitimate forms of art, and many of them work in the same way. It's a sequential storytelling that, when it can convey an image visually, it doesn't need to use words to do it. So I'm a huge reader. I adore books. You can see I've got books all behind me. My house is filled with them. I love traditional books, but I don't think that the value or validity of a traditional written book in any way invalidates sequential storytelling or the comic medium as a great way to tell stories. I think the only thing that would invalidate it is a bad story, and many of these stories are beautifully written.
Mm, absolutely. And because the comic book industry did take off so quickly, there are a lot of bad comic books out there as well, too, just like anything with television and movies. So I think a lot of people are misjudging some of the crap that's out there and not looking at what kind of the comic books that we're looking at, the tried and true archetypes for what comic books actually are.
And the thing is that there's also plenty of bad books out there. There's
Oh,
plenty of bad
yes.
films. There's plenty of
Music.
bad
Yeah.
plays, bad music.
Right.
Every single genre has a lot of dreck in it, and that's eventually forgotten. But the ones that stand the test of time, those are the ones that continue on. And you're right. I think somehow the judgment on comic books seems to overlook that. And but you get that too in music or other things. How many people do you hear, especially now in this age of social media, say, "Oh, there's no good music today. How come there's nobody like the Beatles anymore?" And they say, as if nobody out there is making decent music. But the fact is that there are still phenomenal musical artists making great music. There are phenomenal filmmakers making great films. But when we look at them in context, in the contemporary context, with all of the other films or all the other music, all the other books that come out, it's easy to lose track of the one or two great ones that get lost in the shuffle. But once time goes by, once everybody forgets about a terrible band that is a one-hit wonder, the ones that survive to this day that we still hear on the radio or that we still immediately recognize when it comes on, those are the ones that stand the test of time. And comics really are no different. And now, even today, just a few decades after the real explosion of the comic industry, there are some amazing classic comics that are award-winning comics. You have Mouse, which is about it's a parable actually about Nazi Germany. You have things like the Sin City, which is just so graphically powerful. You have superhero comics like The Dark Knight, The Dark Knight Rises, which was the sort of basis for the rebirth of Batman as a more serious character after the sort of goofiness of the 1960s. All of these very, very significant, and to this day considered to be masterpieces of the genre.
Absolutely. And Stephen King's Cycle of the Werewolf was actually a graphic novel in a way as well too, that was made into the Silver Bullet.
Yes, which unfortunately, I wish the film lived up to the original book. It's not that great. I love it, sort of with nostalgia, but not the best film adaptation. That's not all that uncommon. Stephen King has a terrible track record with his book to film adaptations, but there's a few good ones out there.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of slides to get through, and of course, as usual, you and I could talk for an hour on any given subject. But I do want to say that so we talked a little bit about this age of reason, when the sort of religious dominance of day-to-day life, the religious oppression that ruled so many people's lives took a back seat. But at that time, the age of literature was beginning to flourish. In the 18th century, especially, and very much in the 19th century, literature began to flourish. And we actually see sort of a change in the idea of these heroic stories. They were no longer mythic stories that came from the dawn of time. They were new stories, but they had elements of that sort of mythic, that echo of mythic sort of presence in them. And I think if you want to say maybe the very earliest book that could be considered a superhero story, I might actually point to Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers. And actually, he wrote several books in the series, The Three Musketeers, The Man in the Iron Mask, Adventures of D'Artagnan. But you have now a story or a series of stories, and that right there, it was very unusual. You had sort of a sequential series of interlocking stories about these three of members of the Queen's Musketeers in revolutionary or pre-revolutionary France, who are not superhuman, but virtually undefeatable. They're rakish, but at the same time, they're highly moral. They have a moral compass. They're out there fighting evil. They have a sort of a panache and the swashbuckling, sort of genre created there. And this, I think, is the nascent, origin of the superhero idea of these characters who are larger than life, who are not just ordinary people, but who seem to overcome everything that's thrown at them with the power of their, sort of the power of their morality, the power of their, dedication to the forces of good. They're great at combat. They're super acrobatic, and I think that we can see the beginning of super heroics in even something that early, which I think was written in the 1840s, if I'm not mistaken. I don't even know if I had that up on screen. Sometimes I don't pay attention to what I have on screen, but. But as the 19th century wore on, you started to get more of these these heroic figures. But I think that really so much of the 19th century was dominated by adventure fiction and gothic fiction, which tended to lean into the supernatural and into horror. And the real birth of that sort of heroic fiction, I think it caught on more than anything else in the very late 19th century and at the dawn of the 20th century with something that replaced the penny dreadful. I'm sure you out there know that the penny dreadful were very inexpensive booklets that had either chapters of short stories or short stories in them, usually very garish, very it's horror, it was romance, things like that. But the evolution of the penny dreadful right at the end of the 19th century and into the dawn of the 20th century was the beginning of the pulp magazine. Now, pulp magazines were called that because they were printed on a very cheap paper pulp or wood pulp paper, very inexpensive. They could be a nickel, they could be a dime. And instead of just being one chapter of the story, they were larger magazines. They would have 30, 40, 50 pages in them, and they would be chock full of garish illustrations and stories of daring do and sea-born adventure. And something that began to arise at that time was the mystery man. The mystery man was basically this shadowy hero who would appear out of nowhere. Nobody knew who they were. They would fight off the bad guys and then disappear into the darkness, and nobody knew where they came from. And this, I think, is where we really begin to see the template that will become the superhero story.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Absolutely. Now, the comic books left the highly stylized sexuality behind because a lot of those pulp fictions were known for that as well. But they used a template, made it their own, and off they went.
In 1919, a character that I'm sure almost everyone is going to be familiar with made its first appearance. And this was a real game changer, I would say, because you had the adventures of Zorro. Zorro actually first appeared in a serialized novel called The Curse of Capistrano. And this one has the distinction of being the first, I think, nascent true superhero adventure, because not only was Zorro heroic, swashbuckling, and basically undefeatable. He had the fastest sword, on the West Coast, and fighting back against the great, the corrupt Spanish government on the West Coast of the early United States at that point. Well, I guess it wasn't even technically the United States yet during the era of the Zorro pictures. But he also had a secret identity. He wore a mask. By day, he was this foppish, ineffectual man who I think named Don Diego de la Vega, if I remember correctly. Terrible that I'm not remembering that off the top of my head. But this was really that sort of Clark Kent to Superman idea that had never been done before. And so now you had, I think, all of the ingredients with one small exception. Most of these mystery men, these kind of characters of daring do, were still ordinary mortal men. They were people that didn't have particularly phenomenal powers. They had no divine abilities. They simply were well trained in whatever skill they had and would use guns, rapiers, swords, what have you, to fight back against the forces of evil. So they hadn't quite found what would be the rocket launcher that would propel superheroes to stardom yet. But we also had the dawn of the age of radio at that point, which was remarkable because a lot of these characters were soon adapted for radio. Film was not yet a big thing. I mean, it was just beginning to come into its own in the 1920s or so. But these characters were becoming loved, and all of a sudden, you had people writing not one novel based on a character and then moving on to something else, but successive stories. So you get to listen to or read the adventures of a favorite character over and over again with new adventures, and that was something, again, which was completely a game changer.
And I don't think film will ever catch on anyways.
Yeah, it probably never will.
No, but I agree with you. Zorro, and he was always, as a kid, I was always drawn to this guy as well, too. Even though I didn't understand the historical setting in which he was placed or anything. But again, he has a mask. He has a cape. We have everything there to start building a superhero with.
Now, shortly after about a decade after the appearance of Zorro, you also, as I say, had characters like the Spider, the Ghost, and everything else. But all of these, as I say, were fairly ordinary people who just donned some kind of a costume. Although even the costumes they wore were generally just something to hide their identity. They wrapped a scarf around their face, or they wore ordinary clothing, but dark, so that they could blend into the shadows. And this led to, of course, the Shadow himself. And the Shadow, I think I would officially think of the Shadow as the first true superhero, because not only does the Shadow wear this mask around his face to hide his identity, but he also, for the first time, was one of these characters dealing with the supernatural on a regular basis. And in fact, it's implied, although it's never really consistent, it's implied that he himself has some supernatural abilities. He's trained, with these sort of distant mystics, and so he has the ability to cloud men's minds and vanish from sight. And they say that he can read minds as well. I think what was the tagline of the Shadow series, on what evil lurks in the hearts of men, only the Shadow knows, because he could actually read your mind. So now you had, I think, everything. All of the pieces were in place. You have this caped and cloaked figure who was, had some supernatural abilities, and basically you had the perfect template for the super human character that would become the real birth of the superhero, who would appear in 1938. And 1938 was the moment that they lit the fuse, because this was when Superman appeared to the world. Mm-hmm. Superman was introduced to the world in Action Comics number, what was it? Number, I'm not even sure anymore. I wish I could tell you. This is a comic that was usually an anthology. It had detective stories, it had adventure stories, but the appearance of Superman, who, by the way, Superman's tight-fitting blue and red uniform with the logo on the front was based on the idea of a circus strongman. The circus strongmen tended to wear sort of these tight leotards, and they wanted Superman to appear like a circus strongman, but with, of course, extraordinary strength, much greater than any mortal could have. And it took a few issues before they eventually revealed that Superman not only had remarkable strength and all these incredible powers, but he wasn't human at all. Superman was actually an alien from a distant planet. So now you had this remarkable sort of science fiction angle that they've thrown into this adventure story, and the public went wild. Superman exploded into the public culture, and before long, of course, became a radio show. Would very shortly after that become a star of motion picture serials, and this was truly the birth of the superhero.
Yeah, speaking of things exploding, 1938 wasn't the best time to bring a comic book to life, but I think that this was a central time for Superman to make the scene. And I know that you have some slides regarding the background, which I find absolutely fascinating. But these nothing exists in a vacuum. And the Superman character definitely was developed as a man of his time.
He very much was. In fact, it's interesting is that you were saying, there were a lot of reasons that it wasn't the best time to come up with a new comic, but one of the greatest reasons that it was tough to publish anything at that point was because of rationing, paper shortages, and things like that. But comic books could be produced so cheaply because of the cheap, very low quality pulp paper that they were produced on, that it was one of the few things that you could still realistically publish. But you're referring to the rise of Hitler, I
That's
assume,
right.
and that very much was that was really the reason that Superman came to exist, because Superman was created by two fairly young Jewish men. This was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster grew up in the shadow of Hitler's reign of terror, and they imagined an idea of a character who was powerful enough to basically fly over there and sock Hitler in the jaw, and that was their strongman. That was their character of Superman. And interestingly enough, Joe Shuster, Jerry Siegel was the artist and Joe Shuster was the writer, if I'm not mistaken. I might have that flipped, but I think that Joe Shuster had originally actually conceived of a character he referred to as Superman several years before the creation of the comic character we all know and love. And his Superman, his first idea, was actually a villain. He was a bald-headed, super genius, maniacal scientist who wanted to take over the world. And interestingly enough, he didn't abandon that idea. The character that originally had the name Superman became the greatest villain of the eventual superhero Superman, and that became Lex Luthor. Because Lex Luthor, if you ever watch modern Superman films or cinema, tends to be a sort of a corrupt businessman, and he's always the villain. But in the beginning, he was actually a mad scientist character, which is very popular at that era, of sort of nuclear bombs and the fear of mad science, which was a real presence in the populace. People didn't really trust science, and the idea of anything that could blow up and take out an entire city in one bomb was terrifying. So fear of science created the entire mad science sort of subgenre of fiction at that time.
Right. And as Sarah Yosef says in our chat room, there's also that fear of xenophobia that was running rampant over the world at this time as well, too. And Superman, being an alien, was actually a complete foreigner to this world. So he kind of fits this mold about people were, he was the persecuted individual for a whole, generation, whole group of people that actually rose up to defend other people.
It's interesting too, because much later in the history of the character, that immigrant status becomes much more important. In the beginning, I think what they did is they used, I think, a very clever idea, is that while Superman was in fact an alien, they have him raised by a couple of corn-fed, wholesome farmers from Kansas, and so raised from infancy in this very, very wholesome, completely all-American location and worldview, he becomes this upstanding, perfect Midwestern, example of great Americana. He's wearing colors red, blue, and yellow, but so close to the American flag that he basically looks like a walking American flag. And the catchphrase becomes truth, justice, and the American way. And so they managed to make the idea of this immigrant to be not a frightening character, but they turn him into the melting pot, the American dream of a little, sort of a baby from a far off land who comes to America and becomes sort of the great sort of ideal of humanity.
He becomes anything he wants to be because this is America, and it's worth defending.
Exactly. Now, there is, I think, a very, very interesting mythic strain that we see in this character. And when this age of superheroes came about, we began to see what I think is the resurrection of the old mythology, finding new life in these characters. In fact, I've often thought that Superman is very much reminiscent of biblical characters like Samson, or especially the ancient Greek Hercules, or Hercules, the Greek Roman god, who was a demigod. Again, you have exactly the template, because what you have is this man of remarkable strength who is raised by mortals, but is actually of divine birth, and possesses powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Beyond, okay, there's a nice typo. Beyond those of mortal men, and who becomes a hero and rises to sort of have the power of his father, Zeus, in the old legends, but the morality of humans, and to become a champion of the people. Now, there's a lot more underneath the character of Superman than that mythically, because he also has a fascinating aspect to his origin that comes straight out of Hebraic myth. Moses, of course, was given up by his mother when the Pharaoh of Egypt, wanting to reduce the Hebraic population, ordered that all of the firstborn male children or newborn male children of the people of Egypt be slaughtered, and this terrible crime. And knowing that this was going to happen, young Moses' mother put him in a little basket and basically placed him in the reeds of a river and pushed him down river, hoping that somebody would find him who could raise him in safety. This is a fascinating story, and it's one that is been shown time and time again in films like The Ten Commandments, etc. But it's exactly the way that Superman comes to Earth. Superman's home planet of Krypton is expected to be destroyed. The people there realize that it doesn't have long, and so Jor-El and Lara, Superman's parents, put their baby, who's called Kal-El, into a tiny rocket ship and send him to Earth alone, where they hope that he will be found by someone who can raise him with love and safety. And so you even have this sort of mosaic origin of the character of Superman, and I think that that's remarkable. And of course, again, you have these two nice Jewish boys who created the character. It's impossible not to see that analog and realize that, again, they were creating this mythic new figure that it was a perfect analog of old Hebraic myth.
Yeah, without a doubt. And
I'm sorry, I lost your audio there.
There you go. Can you hear me now? Okay, can you hear me now? So yeah, I was going to say in the suffix at the very end of his name, even the El refers to God as well too. So
yeah, I believe it means angelic in the old Hebrew. I'm afraid that that's not an area of great expertise, but it is essentially a divine name. So Superman, of course, as I say, absolutely took off. Pardon the pun there. He became this remarkably successful character, and as soon as that happened, the comic publishers decided, well, we need more characters. If Superman is this popular, we need to bring in more. And they mined mythology for this. And so you had characters who came to exist, like Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman from the Greek island of they call it Paradise Island in the original comic books. She's actually the daughter of a goddess, and the goddess breathes life into her. But she's basically a reincarnation or a reborn version of Diana / Artemis, depending on whether you're talking about Greek or Roman. Who was the goddess of the hunt. She was a goddess of love, a goddess of fertility. And now you have this strong, incredibly powerful woman. There were not a lot of female superheroes, but Wonder Woman was considered to be, she really was the first great female superhero, and a little bit of a figure of controversy, which we're going to talk about later, because people thought that Wonder Woman was overly sexualized. She's wearing this fairly skimpy outfit with a tiny skirt and the bustier, and people began to worry that this was literature for children and what effect it might have on children. But we'll talk about that in just a minute or two. Another distinctly mythic character that came around the same time was the Flash. And the Flash, the original version of the Flash, looks a bit different than the version that we have today, but was directly taken from the Greek and Roman legend of Hermes or Mercury. Again, you've got the winged feet and the winged helmet. He can run with the speed of thought. So now you actually had not just analogs, but almost direct copies of these mythic figures that were becoming the great superheroes. And so they were creating a new pantheon. They were basically creating an entire new world of myth. It was a new world of myth that was mostly being read by children, but those children would go on to be us, and which is one of the reasons that these characters are as loved as they are today.
Yeah, I think that is the case, and I think that's a reason why that, like you said, your love for mythology developed, and love for all, like, travel with me, or seeing other lands and things. These comic books definitely can inspire that young mind to expand more than you could ever believe.
And there were stories of wonder too. That was something that had been missing for so long, in our sort of popular culture, is that we had stepped away from ideas of sort of magic and these wondrous different realms. And so now, other than just fairy tales, we now had these mythic, larger than life heroic figures. And they were often, I think what's interesting about them in the early days, portrayed as fighting against real world horrors. And we're going to talk specifically about that later on, but we talk about the idea that Superman in some of the early cartoons that were produced by Fleischer Studios, actually fought the Nazis and the Japanese during the Second World War. Batman fought the Japanese in one of the early film serials. In fact, Batman is a great one to talk about because Batman isn't really based on a heroic character, which makes sense because Batman's entire reason for existing was fear. Batman was meant to strike fear into the hearts of evildoers. And if there was any template for Batman, it would probably be the Greek idea of underworld god Hades and Pluto. Where they take sort of evildoers, when they die and drag them down to the underworld. And Batman's entire concept was that he, sort of plumbed the criminal underworld to take down villains. And when Batman decides that he wants to fight crime after his own parents are murdered by a random thug, he wants to fight crime, but he's not really sure what he wants to do. And he's sitting in his own library one evening when a bat flies through the window, and he sees the bat and he says, bats are a symbol of fear for so many people, and criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot. I will become a bat. I will become a source of fear. And I think that's a remarkable story. And Batman very much patterned, I think, after characters like the Shadow, but Batman, again, the first great dark superhero, and probably at this point, next to Superman, the most famous superhero in history. Certainly has the largest number of films under his belt.
Oh yeah, and the reason why I prefer Batman over Superman is simply because he is very fallible, right? He can make mistakes. He's not invincible. He's just a regular person, and that's the reason why I was always drawn to him. And whenever I first saw the slide about your allusion to Pluto, I thought, I don't know if this makes any sense. But then I thought about it some more, and they are indeed both chthonic figures, right? They both are from the Earth itself, and not only that, but he protects the land from which he arises out of as well too. So I think that does make a very good literal sense whenever I examine it more and more. But yeah, Batman, even though he's over there with DC, he's always been my favorite guy because it shows what a guy with a little bit of money can do.
Talk about being chthonic. He even operates from a cave beneath the earth.
Absolutely. He comes out of there with his Batmobile.
Now, in an age where cinema was beginning to take hold, one of the first things that filmmakers capitalized on was the popularity of superheroes and some of the most well-known superheroes. And at this point, by the way, I should point out that a lot of the characters that we know and love today, like Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, the X-Men, the Avengers, didn't exist yet. The Marvel comics had not really come into play yet. The only superhero from that pantheon who did come about during World War II was actually Captain America. Captain America would end up becoming a very popular character, but but none of the other Marvel canon was out there yet. But the filmmakers quickly rose to this, and they knew that a lot of kids went to the movies every Saturday to see Westerns and things like that, and so they could inexpensively produce weekly serials, weekly short subjects that were only 10 or 15 minutes long, that would be one chapter and guaranteed to keep kids coming back. And of course, Batman and Robin, Superman, Captain America, and even Captain Marvel, the DC or Timely Comics version of Captain Marvel, were all portrayed among these, along with all the Westerns and all the different giant robot adventures, is some of the greatest superheroes ever. And so the studios knew that they were big money, but as the era of superheroes began to grow and comic books became wildly popular, some serious controversy began to grow as well. We already said that Wonder Woman had caused some consternation among parents and among psychologists who felt that possibly this over-sexualization of this woman, and of course she was also a very strong woman, which they felt made her masculine, and that was worrisome. They knew that Batman and Robin lived together alone in a great house, and this was a man and a young teenage boy who was not a blood relative, and that was of concern as well. And so in the early 1950s, I think 1954, the book was published, which changed the face of comics for a very long time to come, and that was Seduction of the Innocent, the influence of comic books on today's youth. This was by a very, I would say, sort of self-aggrandizing doctor by the name of Frederick Wertham. And Wertham argued that Wonder Woman was a figure of bondage and it would turn women to lesbianism, that Batman and Robin were sort of a shaded gay couple, and all of these different things, and that comic books would literally destroy the innocence and the morality of youth, and this changed everything. All of a sudden, comics were under a microscope, and the horror stories that were sometimes published in comics back then, because you still had gothic tales, all suddenly were outlawed. And I think I had it up on the screen there a moment ago. Something called the Comics Code was established, and I believe it actually officially went into effect in 1954. And the Comics Code was basically an enforced censorship. And if a comic didn't have the approved Comics Code authority, it could be removed from magazine stores. And of course, parents would never allow their children to read it. And so now comic books were suddenly radically sanitized for what they considered to be appropriate children's literature.
Right. A brief precursor to the satanic panic of the 1980s.
Yes, very much so, I'd say. And, it's the sort of thing that happens again and again. We saw that when Harry Potter, books came out, and parents, afraid that their children were going to be lured into witchcraft and Satanism by the Harry Potter books as well. There's always somebody out there willing to panic.
Yes, absolutely. Although now that you're bringing up Wonder Woman, I think I might be into bondage now.
So this
just like that. See, just like that. See how quickly we go to that?
Well, seduction certainly, but I'm not sure how innocent you are. So,
all right, I get.
so the nature of comic books changed radically, and these characters became, as I say, far more sanitized. The Batman TV show of the 1960s, which we're going to be talking about in just a moment, introduced Aunt Harriet, so that there would be a female influence in the house and everything. And Superman became the big blue Boy Scout. He became this very fatherly figure who was constantly sternly, telling kids to eat their vegetables and stay in school and everything. And the more questionable aspects, or at least in some people's opinions, were wiped out from comics. Comics were forbidden from showing the supernatural. You could have characters pretending or disguising themselves as vampires, werewolves, or ghosts, but they always had to be revealed at the end as a person perpetrating a hoax, because they didn't want children to be getting into occultism. And so it was, as I say, it was a dramatic impact on the comic industry. I'm not sure that it negated sales at all, but it certainly neutered the storytelling ability of many of these comic artists. But then something wonderful happened, and I was a little too young to remember it, but we had the 1960s. The 1960s, the era of Vietnam, civil rights, Woodstock, and the implosion of the American fairy tale. That sort of squeaky clean 1950s Leave It to Beaver image began to fall apart. You had kids growing their hair out, experimenting with marijuana and drinking. Free love became a thing, and this liberation of the spirit that happened throughout the 1960s changed American culture permanently. And as a result of that, the squeaky clean image of comics began to erode as well. Now, at this point, for several years, a Superman TV show called The Adventures of Superman had been on the air. And we talked a little while ago about George Reeves. George Reeves, the actor who played Superman for all those years on The Adventures of Superman, who ended up being terribly typecast. But if anyone here, and I'm sure some of you do, remember that show, or have even seen it in reruns, you can see how, again, remarkably squeaky clean that show is. And Superman is just like your dad. He's admonishing villains for basically breaking the law and jaywalking and everything else, and it did change the way that superheroes were seen. But that squeaky clean image no longer flew in the 1960s, and so the changeover was pretty radical, and we got the Batman TV show. Now, the Batman TV show had sexual innuendo, all done very innocently, but sexual innuendo. It had, ridiculously over-the-top campy villains, bright Technicolor sets, Batman and Robin every week being, they're going to be sewn into a giant Christmas stocking or pressed into a giant pancake by all these giant over-the-top machines. And it was overtly absurdist. It was ridiculous. It was over the top, and it was camp, because they wanted to show you that 1950s morality and then skewer it completely. And of course, the show was a massive hit, and it defined Batman for an entire generation.
I still,
or no longer a dark character at that point.
That's right. To this day, I still do the Batusi.
Yeah, the Batusi, which is so culturally relevant, even showed up in Pulp Fiction. So
Yes.
Tarantino can't unwind too much about superheroes when he's aping them in his films, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah, but those lycra or spandex, what are they were their uniforms and everything. It actually hurts the eyes whenever you go back and look at them to this day. I've always been a big fan of Lost in Space, and I remember the first season of Lost in Space was in black and white, and then it went to that terrible bright orange and yellow and green jumpsuits and everything just because they could. Yeah, so I mean, even to this day, like I said, it still hurts my eyes if I look at it.
In fact, Lost in Space is an interesting case because the first season of Lost in Space was genuine sci-fi.
Yeah,
It
oh,
had
absolutely,
drama,
yeah.
it had stakes. It was many of the episodes of the original Lost in Space written by some quite notable sci-fi authors, but they jumped the shark, as they say, and ended up going for a much more goofy, much more kid-friendly show with the Technicolor and the much less. Everything was a joke after a while. But the original episodes of the show were actually dark and serious. And in fact, the pilot episode of Lost in Space, Dr. Smith is sent to kill the Robinson family, and he sneaks on with the intention of murdering them. I mean, and it was
That's
a
right.
very dark. There's death and there's a consequence, but as I say, it's interesting because that's the real flip. There is that went from dark to squeaky clean, where everything else was at that point transferring from squeaky clean to a little bit on the darker side. In fact, the real genesis of that movement was the birth of Marvel Comics, and we were talking about that earlier. Now, this is where I think we're going to get into your bread and butter, because I know you're a Marvel guy. But Marvel Comics, although there were many creators behind the various characters in Marvel Comics, two of the real juggernauts, really the heart of Marvel Comics, were Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Stan Lee, who was primarily a writer, and Jack Kirby, primarily an artist. But of course, they all sort of wore different hats at that time. And Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, among others, like Steve Ditko, imagined a universe that was very different from the DC universe of these caped, upstanding mythic heroes, and created heroes that were far more human, but not quite. So you had now the birth of characters like the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and Spider-Man, and all of these characters had something very unique in common. They were effectively mutants. They weren't created by magic. They weren't created by technology. They were infected by radiation. The Fantastic Four on a space mission got bombarded with cosmic rays, which caused their bodies to mutate in strange ways. The X-Men were referred to as the children of the atom, and young Peter Parker was a high school student bitten by a radioactive spider and mutating to develop the powers of a spider. So you have radiation is now your big villain, because of course radiation is twisting the body and giving these people remarkable powers, remarkable but terrifying powers. And the birth of this age, again, of this fear of atomic radiation and sort of atomic science, so they capitalized on that and created this entire new universe that was much more, it felt much more like it existed in our world. In fact, the characters like Spider-Man and the Avengers, they had their headquarters in New York, whereas with the DC Comics universe of Batman and Superman, it was all fictional towns. But now Marvel Comics had people that felt real, with real world problems, and they lived in our world. And we felt like if we were in New York, we could see Spider-Man swinging between the buildings.
If you go to Times Square right now, you can have your picture taken with Spider-Man. You know that,
I have
right?
no doubt of that whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I like about these characters too is the vast majority do not want these powers. They were thrust upon them. So
Correct.
this is one of those cases where greatness is thrust upon these people, and now they have to do with it. What do you do with it? Like with Spider-Man, for instance, it's one of those things where he's uneasy about it, and as the story goes, he passes up catching a robber or whatever, who eventually kills one of his family members. So you have this kind of, they almost become tragic characters at this point. They have flaws, and hubris and everything else.
In fact, another tragic hero would be the Incredible Hulk. The Incredible Hulk is essentially this Jekyll and Hyde style character, but he was an ordinary scientist who attempts to save a young man who who rides his motorcycle onto a test range, an atomic test range, and he races out to try to save this young man and gets caught in the blast of this experimental gamma radiation bomb, bombarded with gamma rays, and this forces him to turn into this massive, lumbering, destructive rage monster, which became the Incredible Hulk, which today, more than 50 years later, remains one of the most popular characters in comicdom, but has always been a very tragic character, because not only does this Hulk character effectively ruin Bruce Banner's life, but he can't control it, and it's often just a destructive monster. The hero aspect of it is often sort of a side effect of this massive destructive rage. And Spider-Man, as you say, not wanting these powers, ends up misusing his powers, causing the death of his own uncle, giving rise to one of probably the greatest lines in all of comic history: with great power comes great responsibility. But these characters now are becoming a new kind of mythic, but a much more relatable, much more human, and much more sort of mundane degree of mythic, and have just as much lasting power at this point as the sort of the great heroic characters of the DC universe.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, the X-Men are probably the real, I guess, the black sheep of the Marvel universe, because the X-Men were referred to as the children of the atom, and they were all not merely mutants, but often mutated in a way that made them an outcast from society, and that became a remarkable series of storylines that has carried the X-Men universe for a couple generations now, where the people are respond to them with fear and hatred. And many of the best storylines of the X-Men universe involve basically this fear of difference, this fear of the other. We talk about that all the time on this channel. Mutant filth, disease. They believe that they're subhuman. And yet, despite all of that, the X-Men always stand up for humanity. And one of the great conflicts in the X-Men universe is the idea of the mutants who do stand up for humanity, like the X-Men, and then you have the other mutants who are tired of being oppressed and treated so badly, and so try to rise up against. But you have the consequence of the hatred creating the villain here, which I think is remarkable.
Yeah. So what I like so much about this, especially whenever you study literature and you study archetypes, one of the things that started to develop in the Middle Ages was this idea of an outward manifestation of an inward spiritual state, that you could actually tell if the person was good or evil just by looking at the outward signs. This, like with Superman, ruggedly handsome, chiseled, all that kind of stuff, farm boy. These guys here, they look like monsters for the most part. They're terrifying, but they still have that humanity to them. And that really takes the idea of the archetype and turns it on its head, because now we have to judge these people, who they are, by not what they look like, but by their deeds.
Very much so. Now, folks, just a quick note here before we continue is we're just about at the 10 o'clock hour here, and we do have a fair amount left to cover. And so if folks want to stick around with us, I think it's worth talking about. So we're gonna extend this a little bit, maybe go to 10:30 here. Hopefully you'll stick around. If not, you can watch us later in replays. And by the way, anybody who's watching this after the fact, welcome aboard. Glad to have you with us tonight. But I don't want to leave at this early stage of the game, because we actually have some of the most fascinating characters left to go. And this is one that was a special request of yours, Ron, and I think is very worth talking about, because it exemplifies what you're just talking about, the idea of the fear that the outward appearance is actually a reflection of the soul, and how different that was with characters like the mutated characters of the X-Men. And I think one of the most fascinating and emotionally complex characters is Nightcrawler.
Absolutely. So, as a boy, my mother would give me $1 a week for me to get comic books. And back in 1980, I remember that X-Men #1, it was a reboot, came out, and she gave me that dollar, and I went down there. And this was not a 25-cent comic book or a 35-cent comic book. This was a $1 comic book. So this was pretty impressive for Ron to be getting this book. So I take it home and I quickly devour it, and I find this character in here of the Nightcrawler, and it opens up in his origin story. It's Eastern Europe someplace. The church is tracking him down. Fire, people carrying torches, people carrying, hose and shovels and all this other kind of stuff, tracking him down to kill him, because he is believed to be a demon. Again, he appears to be a demon, looks like it, and so the Catholic Church is coming out after him very, very hard. And as his origin story goes, we find out that he is actually devoutly Catholic, which is really strange. And he has a lot of controversy to this as well, too, because a lot of people think that Marvel Comics spends too much time on his religion. But I think that it's necessary to show that he was persecuted by something that he loves so much, and he's still helping humanity that despises him.
Very much so. And in fact, again, he's always been a fascinating character because he's both morally complex, but he also has one of the greatest moral compasses in the Marvel universe.
Absolutely. Like
And
the
this
Beast as well,
outwardly
too.
diabolical appearance, which often causes people to immediately hate and fear him.
Yeah, like Beast as well too. He's very erudite. He's well read. But he looks like he's covered. He looks like a Sasquatch.
Uh, and this is true again of so many of the X-Men characters, that they're meant to be monstrous on the outside, and to show that just because you look different on the outside doesn't mean that you are evil on the inside. And that's kind of the entire crux of the X-Men. And a lot of people have regarded it as a coded reference to being queer, being homosexual or bisexual, having gender dysphoria and things like that. And in fact, they've addressed that in the X-Men films and in later comic books as well, where a lot of these characters are now coming out with diverse sexualities as well. And that's something that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, is how the comic books have kind of evolved to be more like the world around us. But I want to sort of juxtapose this with an idea that almost reverses the idea of the outwardly grotesque appearance and the inward beauty, with the opposite, which is the idea that so many of these heroes are portrayed in a very idealized way. They're always in phenomenal shape. Superheroes tend to be classically handsome or classically beautiful, and they were for so long infallible. Even when they were at their very last, they stood up proudly, and they eventually used their great virtue to defeat evil. But one of the things that Marvel Comics introduced that really had never been a part of the narrative before was the idea that heroes can fail. And that is remarkable. I think it's an important lesson for people to know, is that even the greatest of us can fail sometimes. And so Spider-Man has hung up his costume and walked away. Spider-Man is a character who is so morally good, and yet has suffered so much from the having these powers. In fact, one of the most long-running aspects of Spider-Man's story is that he is generally hated and feared by a lot of people, largely egged on by a newspaper editor named J. Jonah Jameson. And back in the day, they used to like to make alliterations for all the comic characters, but Peter Parker, J. Jonah Jameson, etc., but who refuses to believe that this character is not a criminal under the surface, and is constantly printing terrible stories about him, claiming that he's responsible for crimes and things like that. And all Peter Parker has ever wanted to do is help anyone. And so here's a character who's suffered dramatically, to help people. And then, of course, you've got Captain America. We haven't really spoken much about Captain America. The comic first came out in the 1940s during the Nazi era. In fact, it was a very bold character who often fought Nazis in those early days. But Captain America was resurrected, literally resurrected, in the 1960s as a member of the New Avengers, and is this amazingly upstanding, morally stout character who, again, as we see time and time again in the comics and the films, has this heart of iron. But even Captain America has been placed in a position where he doubts himself, and he doubts the world that he's dedicated himself to. And I think one of the boldest and wisest things they ever did is allow Captain America to question the U.S. government. I mean, he was a soldier. He was a good boy. He was out there. He's wearing a costume that's essentially an American flag. And he came to a point where he realized that the government was fallible, and that he couldn't always, simply bow to what the government had to say. And that's a very bold choice, and something that a lot of people disapproved of. A lot of people got very angry about this. They did it with Superman as well. Superman, who was also very much a walking flag back in, I think it was the 1990s or early 2000s. They had a storyline where the tagline of truth, justice, and the American way, Superman said, I can't be that anymore. I'm not an American. I belong to the world. If I'm going to have these extraordinary powers, I can't use them only for the good of one country. I have to uphold the ideals of everyone. And boy, out here in the real world, people were enraged at the idea that Superman wasn't going to be the true blue American anymore. And that, again, it's that sort of xenophobia and nationalism that, unfortunately, in a lot of ways created a lot of these characters in the beginning when we were a more naive people, a more naive country. But a lot of these characters have broken through those borders and become much more real as a result of it. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, beautifully said.
So in the 60s, we had a lot of stuff going on. We had, again, the civil rights movement. We had women's rights, coming to the fore. We had Vietnam. So people questioning the government, people, questioning the terrible racism that was still widespread. A lot of, a lot of places were still segregated. African Americans still often had to sit at the back of the bus, drink from a separate water fountain, etc. And it was a very dark time. And in the early 1970s, comic books finally began to address this, and again started moving more into the century that they belonged in. And in a remarkable series of comics starring the characters of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, which was an award-winning series, they actually began to directly address racism. And there's a remarkable, affecting panel in one of these early comics where a black man approaches Green Lantern and says, "Hey, I read about you. I see you all the time. I hear you're up in space fighting for the purple people, and you're, in the center of the earth fighting for the yellow people and all this other, but you ain't done nothing for the black people. Why is that?" And he has no answer. It's remarkable. I mean, he just hangs his head. In a later panel in that same series, he talks about the death of Martin Luther King Jr. He talks about the death of President Kennedy. And again, this is remarkable because now he's directly connecting these comic characters to the real world. It's not even, metaphorical anymore. Now he's directly addressing issues of racism. They would go on in that comic to try as best they could to address racism, to address drug abuse. Green Arrow's young ward, who's basically the Robin to his character named Speedy, ends up being addicted to heroin. I mean, these were dark stories, but they were important. And I guess, some of you out there may think to yourself, there's no place in that for that kind of thing in comics. Comics are for kids. They should be these nice stories. And, that has always existed. There have always been comics where it's about fighting aliens, or it's about fighting, giant lizards from the center of the earth. And those comics will always exist. But kids live in the world. They live in the real world, and they live in a world where people get addicted to drugs. They live in a world where people are, where bigotry exists and people are racially profiled. They live in a world where domestic abuse happens. And we shouldn't pretend that they don't. And having these comic characters coming out with these remarkably positive stances against these evils that exist in the world, I think it's wonderful. I think it's not sheltering the kids. It's about telling them that you can stand up to this kind of thing. So Absolutely. I thought it was a remarkable series, and it led to, of course, the rise of the black superhero, which to this point there were very few black characters in comics. Certainly black superheroes were virtually non-existent. Marvel paved the way, but they weren't alone, and we ended up with characters like Black Lightning, the Black Green Lantern, which was a remarkable storyline, and that directly grew out of the racism stories that were happening in the 1970s. So Black Green Lantern named John Stewart, who is still a canon part of the Green Lantern mythology to this day. In fact, has been sort of hinted at in the television shows, and is hopefully going to be seen in an upcoming HBO Max series. You also had Marvel characters like the Falcon, who was the sort of associate or sidekick of Captain America. And of course, I would think at this point, everybody knows Black Panther. Black Panther, very, very ironically named Black Panther, who is from an African country called Wakanda, and ends up becoming a crime fighter as well. But the rise of the black superhero was a huge change in culture. It was all of a sudden making these heroic characters out of people who just a few years earlier couldn't even sit next to you at in a restaurant. And so it was a massive cultural shift, which I think was remarkable.
Yeah, now I want to make a point too. Whenever we were showing that one about the black gentleman coming up and talking, what it also goes to show is this: America doesn't have to necessarily be attacked by outside enemies. We can have things attacking us from within as well. And that has probably always been that way, but we never really addressed it, right? We've let these things go on. But now when we talk about things like, racism and drug addiction, all this other stuff, these are very real enemies that derive from within our country, something we've never talked about before. So now these superheroes have to operate from within and from without. For the first time, we see this as well too, which makes it a great storyline. And the thing about Wakanda and the thing about the Black Panther and everything is that I remember whenever this movie first came out, how well received it was, because people were wanting this, they were craving this. They People of color wanted to see representation of something else rather than a criminal on screen, or a pimp or whatever. They now had a superhero that they could look up to.
And the thing about Black Panther too is that it was historic in a lot of ways. It wasn't the first black superhero portrayed in film. The Falcon had already appeared in several of the Avengers films at that point. The character of Blade had appeared, but Falcon was a secondary character in in a white man's film, the Captain America movies. And Blade was a dark character who was essentially violent, angry, and this very, very dark sort of anti-hero character. Black Panther was none of those things. He was a king in his own country. He was a hero, and he was this remarkably good character. And so he was a hero to thousands of millions of black youth in this country and black adults who had not seen this degree of heroicism, or sort of this great black superhero who had been beloved for, again, 2 generations at that point, brought to life with such reverence in a black directed film, with a cast that was almost entirely black, set primarily in an African nation, and everything about it celebrated Africa and celebrated African heritage. And that was this was a seismic shift, and something which to this day, the new Black Panther film that just came out earlier this summer continued that trend. I don't think it was as good as the original. Unfortunately, of course, the great Chadwick Boseman, who played Black Panther in the original, passed away tragically a year or so ago. But nonetheless, it's keeping that legacy alive, and I think that that's an extraordinary thing.
Right, and there was no black exploitation going on here either. It wasn't the studio was trying to make a buck off of this. This was probably a $200 million movie that they put the same kind of budget in this, and it was really something. I mean, it was something that I was really proud of, even though it had nothing to do with it. But as somebody that loved comic books and somebody that loves the idea of reaching out and being inclusive, it really made my day to see this happen.
It did me too. And that trend, thankfully, has continued. A few years after the introduction of characters like Black Panther, we had Marvel characters especially beginning to increase the presence of female heroes, and specifically female heroes of color, which was remarkable. Some of the most notable would be a long-standing character by the name of Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel originally was a white man. Later, the mantle was passed on to a woman, and then after that onto a woman of color. And so Monica Rambeau, the black Captain Marvel, who's actually appeared in a couple of the appeared in the Captain Marvel movie, not as Captain Marvel, but pre that, and then recently in the WandaVision television show. And another amazingly successful character and wildly popular is Aurora Monroe, or Storm, one of the X-Men, who was considered to be a goddess in her home village in Africa because she was born with these remarkable weather control powers. But both of these are independent, strong-willed women who have been great leaders in their comics, have upheld comics of their own. And again, it's just moving the conversation forward in a way that I think is remarkable. It's still fairly male-dominated in the comic world, but women of color, people of color, growing so that it's beginning to look. The comic world is beginning to look more like our world, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And even those two African characters that you point out, those two characters of color, they are beautiful human beings, but they're not overly sexualized either. They're not there solely for their looks.
100% correct. I mean, Storm has definitely had some skimpy outfits over the time, but that was more a function of the age that her character was created in, and it was an era when almost everybody had a skimpy and skin tight outfit. So you can't really blame them too much for that.
Yeah, look what they wore in Star Trek. I find it hard to believe that somebody wore a miniskirt.
Now, one wonderful thing that happened a few years ago is the long-running character Falcon. We've referenced Falcon a few. Falcon is a young African-American man by the name of Sam Wilson, who became the character of the Falcon, who actually really very much an Icarus character, like from old Greek mythology, has a pair of wings, and for many, many years was the sidekick, although very, very respectfully portrayed in the comics, was the sidekick to Captain America. And in the comics, comic characters live and die all the time, and they come back and they die again. But Captain America was killed in the comics quite a few years back, and they gave the mantle of Captain America to Sam Wilson, this young black man who had been the sidekick for so very long. And this was remarkable in a lot of ways, because again, it's every time you need to make a new step, you need to cross a different line. And here you have Captain America. This is the true blue ideal of the American dream. This wonderful, patriotic, upstanding character. He's the Superman character of the Marvel universe, and the character is now a black man. And this is remarkable because, again, it's pushing a line. And not only did Sam Wilson become Captain America in the comic books, but he was recently portrayed in the, as I say, we've seen him in many of the Avengers movies, and he was recently portrayed as taking on the Captain America mantle in the television series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which was remarkable. And that series addressed racism. It addressed cultural pushback and xenophobia and everything, and was a very progressive series. It was a series that, of course, so many people decried for its wokeness. But as you and I have discussed before, what's the opposite of being woke? It's being asleep. And I think if I have to be one, I'm going to be woke all the way. So this, I think, was, again, a remarkable change. And I love the fact that the comic universe looks so much like the real world, with characters who are of characters of color. There's disabled characters in the comic universe, and we're also seeing some interesting moral gray, and that's something that's been there for a while. But some characters that prove that you can be a hero even if you're not perfect. And so we have characters. We've talked about Batman. Of course, Batman's always been a violent and very angry character. We have the very popular X-Men character of Wolverine, who is not opposed to murder. Now, this is something that does open up a lot of questions, but I think that that's also worthwhile. I think that there's no reason comics can't be good literature, and good literature makes you ask questions. Wolverine is as close to being not a hero as you can be. He can be murderous. He can be incredibly rageful and out of control, and yet still ultimately has a good heart, but it forces you to ask questions. And in the last few years, of course, the rise of the very, very popular character of Deadpool. We were talking before the broadcast about the remarkable comedic actor Ryan Reynolds, who plays Deadpool, this sort of wisecracking, smart-ass character who is extremely violent, but it's done in a very, very over-the-top and comedic way. And again, a character extremely morally gray, but incredibly popular. And I think his next film will actually star Deadpool and Wolverine, so you've got a double dose of that moral gray area there. So comics don't have to be squeaky clean anymore. They don't have to be this perfect ideal of perfect heroism. They can have people who have failings and actually question the line between good and evil.
Absolutely. I happen to have, I'm the proud owner of X-Men #1, illustrated by Frank Miller. Not X-Men #1, Wolverine #1. And whenever I was a kid and I started to read it, I thought, what is this guy? I thought whenever I picked it up, I originally thought that he might be a villain that they were introducing within this series. And there was something about him that I liked because, again, he had this thrust upon him as well, too. This wasn't something that he chose to be. And he was, he really kind of hated the idea that he was made into this creature. But then, you said he's morally ambivalent, but he usually does tend to err on the side of goodness rather than evil.
Yeah, 100% correct. So actually, in fact, the character of Wolverine was originally introduced as an antagonist. I believe that he was a part of a super team from Canada called Alpha Flight, but ultimately becomes an antagonist in his first issue, and I think faced off against the Hulk. I think that was the very first ever appearance of Wolverine. It wasn't in his own comic book, of course, but so I think they actually did originally introduce him as, at the very least, an antagonistic, if not overtly villainous character. So again, character who sort of has crossed that line many times over during his history.
That's a good point because, yeah, early on he was in the Spider-Man comic books. He was in Captain American comic. A little bit this they were trying to work out to see, I think, exactly what he was going to be, and for a long time he almost acted like a WWE character. Whenever you didn't know exactly which side he was going to go on.
The ultimate irony, of course, being that the character was originally portrayed as being extremely small, short, and stocky. This basically like this little, Wolverine means little wolf. I mean, he
Yeah,
was
yeah.
meant to be this incredibly small, compact character. And then, of course, when they cast him in the film, they cast Hugh Jackman, who's, I think, 6'2" or something like that. And that had the canon, the peanut gallery of screaming that it wasn't canon anymore. Of course, he became such an iconic Wolverine that everybody forgot that the character was meant to be short. So
Absolutely.
so the progress of sort of social awareness, social consciousness in comics has not stopped yet. And in the last few years, I think one of the wonderful things that the comics have done is very important to me as somebody in the LGBT community, is begin to really let their queer characters shine. There have been gay characters, bi characters, and other queer characters in comics for many years, but often in a very, very subtle or low key way. But slowly they are beginning to. And in fact, over the last several years during Pride Month, every year, they've even been introducing Pride-themed comic books. And so Marvel and DC both have their annual Pride issues. And actually, something recently that was very, very controversial, because, again, not everybody has the same view of the world, is Superman's son, Jonathan Kent, came out as bisexual and ended up in a same-sex relationship. And that was particularly traumatizing to certain people, because at that time he had the mantle of Superman. His father, the original Superman, was off world, and so Jonathan Kent was flying around in a Superman outfit and being Superman for the world, and yet also being in a same-sex relationship. So again, I can imagine that some people hearing this, might roll their eyes at that. But you have to understand that, again, these people exist in the world, that the world is full of people of many, many different sexual identities, many different racial and cultural identities. And we have to live in a world where we accept that these people exist. We can't simply erase them from existence. We can't pretend that they don't exist. And for me, as a teenager, if I had ever been able to read a comic where one of my heroes was either gay, bisexual, or in some way gender questioning, it would have been monumental for me. And so I am very proud that kids today get to read about these characters in heroic context, and is acceptable. So I think that that's a wonderful thing. And the good versus evil argument doesn't always have to be, mythic evil as well. Sometimes it can be very real world evil. Just a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2019, a comic book came out called Superman Smashes the Klan. And that is very bold because, of course, the Klan is the Ku Klux Klan is a real world organization which is founded based on hate and bigotry, and over the course of the last century has performed horrific atrocities, murders, lynchings, etc. And fascinatingly, just in case you think, wow, it's amazing that they're going that woke, it was actually inspired by a real radio serial from 1946 where Superman went up against, I believe they were called the Order of the Fiery Cross. They, at that time, did not feel that they could name the Klan, and so they called them the Order of the Fiery Cross, but they were this cloaked and hooded organization dedicated to bigotry and hatred, and they were very clearly the Klan. And so Superman has been fighting the good fight now for 85, getting close to 90 years, which I think is remarkable. In fact, back in 1949, this is a meme that has made its way around the internet a lot recently, but back in 1949, there was an ad that came out, and it showed something that people have actually thought was a hoax, but it was not. And it was Superman in an anti-bigotry ad, actually telling a bunch of school kids that the kids in their school, their fellow students, are of all races, all colors, and even of all religious backgrounds, and that if you hear anybody speaking against them for that reason, that you should know that that is un-American and you should stand up for them. That was 1949, which to me is absolutely remarkable.
Was this the time of McCarthyism, wasn't it?
I believe it was before that, but don't quote me on that. I'm not sure that the Red Scare was in full force yet. Although, again, I could be wrong about that.
Yeah.
So maybe worth looking into.
Yeah, but that's interesting. I like that idea. Whenever I first saw that, I didn't believe it at first, and then
I thought it was a hoax as well.
I did too. Yeah, absolutely. And then Superman taking on the Klan. I will tell you this: if Florida doesn't know about it, they probably will find out about it. And I'm sure it's going to be banned
Yeah, Superman will end up being banned by Governor DeSantis any moment now, I would
any
imagine.
moment. Any moment. That's right. That's right.
So, guys, it is 10:24, just a few minutes shy of 10:30. Hope that you stuck around with us and enjoyed this very, very different episode of Myths, Mysteries, and Monsters that we did tonight. I'm going to confuse that every time. I came up with a name, and I'm still going to jumble those words up every time. But Monday night Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters, we really want to spread our wings and talk about a lot of different subjects. And myths are certainly very much on the table tonight. Want to thank you all for coming aboard. We hope that if you enjoyed this show, that you will hit that like button, leave us a comment, subscribe below the video, especially if you're watching this after the fact. That's a huge help to us if you leave comments. Let us know what you think. A subscription is a wonderful thing, and you can catch all of our other episodes. We're actually coming very close, Ron, to being on the air for a year.
That's incredible.
Yep.
That's incredible.
We have, I think, 27 or 28 episodes under our belt now, and on a variety of different topics. And we really hope that you guys will check those out if you haven't seen any of our old episodes. If you are interested in what Ron and I do, of course, we are both writers, both legend hunters. You can find my books at ghostboypress.com, which is my website where I sell books on the subject of Dracula and Legend of Sleepy Hollow, ghosts and things like that. I have a forthcoming book you can pre-order on werewolf legends and the Beast of Gévaudan, which we'll have a future episode on. And Ron, let them know where they can find you and all your wonderful publications.
You can find me on Amazon, but there's only one place to find my sweet dance moves, and that's on this channel right here. So as we go out, I'll do a little bit of the Batusi on our way out. And if you want to see more of that, you can always be a super chatter as well, too, because I will dance for cash as well.
Very good. Well, guys, once again, as always, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Hope that you had a good time. And we will see you in 1 week from tonight on Monday Night Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.